Folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about voodoo economics. You could also call it excessive government intervention in the market operation. I saw a number of pieces recently coming out of Africa. Now, a lot of African countries are basket cases, but you get situations that just defy sort of description almost, or certainly when you first look at it. Now, in the case of say, Nigeria, it's just one example of others. Nigeria actually has at the moment, and has had recently, quite a substantial food surplus. Now, it's quite a populous country, but it has a food surplus, quite a decent food surplus, really. So you would think that that food surplus would lead to at least affordable food, vegetables and so on, grain. But in fact, the reverse is the case in Nigeria, and so much so that the Nigerian government has declared a state of emergency on the basis of food affordability, so the price of food. So, at first take, I thought, what are they talking about here? Because they've got a food surplus, so an oversupply of food. In fact, they got so much food that it's rotting in the warehouses and even in the shops because there's so much of it around, and yet the price of it is going up, and it's going up so much so that the people can't afford to eat because the food is so expensive. There's food in massive surplus is so expensive. Now, market forces would say, well, if there's that much food around, then the sellers of the food, the farmers and so on, they would sort of sell the food for whatever price they've got because there's so much of it. They can afford to lower the price, and so really, if in such a situation of surplus, because the people aren't demanding, the demand for food hasn't increased, it's the supply of food's increased, so the price should go down, or at the very least stay the same. But according to Economics 101, the price should go down as different farmers compete to sell their product, or the grain suppliers compete to sell their product against the corn supplier, and so on. Some market competitive economics, but no, the reverse is occurring. Now, there's a few other things that are worth looking at here in terms of governments intervening. Now, Western governments are massively intervening in all ways. I mean, the West has ceased to be a market-driven economy. They'll have the two corner shops competing against each other, but nothing else. The big multinational firms realise competition is expensive. We can't have black lesbians all over the employment lists if we have to compete, because we have to compete in the market. We have to hire the best people, and the best people won't be the black lesbians. So you can either have your affirmative action, or you can have a competitive market, but you can't have both. And it's the same for any government intervention. And it typically, unless the de-escalation of intervention is sort of itself carefully managed, it often results in far more problems than it ever may have solved. It's something market intervention is something politicians reach for. Now, whether it's a centrally planned economy where the intervention is meant to be, the market is not meant to exist, then resources are meant to be allocated based on ideologically presumed need. But where governments intervene, it's usually to offset what they perceive is an undesirable development, or will be an undesirable development if market forces run for themselves. Now, in Nigeria, given when the price of energy started to go up, the Nigerian government began to offer subsidies, for not simply energy like fuel, but also fertilizers, things like that. So a lot of Nigeria's got a lot of arable land, by the way. It's not short on farmland. They're not very efficient at what they do. So instead of promoting efficient farming, they promoted marginal farming by again, these subsidies on things. So a lot of people were getting into farming in an area of high unemployment, by the way, getting into farming because the government subsidies meant that they could could farm, marginal land, and because of the subsidies, they could make that farm viable, but only because of the subsidies. If the subsidies didn't exist on things, again, like fertilizer and fuel, if the subsidies didn't exist, then that farming would not have been viable. So anyway, the government has been removing or reducing the subsidies, and so suddenly that land is not viable, and the inefficient farming practices, even the efficient farms, or the hitherto efficient farms, started to fall into inefficient practices because of the subsidies. So rather than turn the farm into an even more efficient, using the subsidies to create an even more efficient farming, instead they went the other way. And farm owners that could only afford to hire 10, for example, 10 workers, because of the subsidies, rather than make more efficient farming, they decided to become local chieftain, local sort of dispensers of patronage, and makes them like the big man in the neighbourhood, and they employed 100 people because the subsidies allowed them to. So there's a whole lot of inefficient practices that crept in because of these subsidies. That's not the only reason, by the way, but that's certainly a key reason. So when the subsidies are withdrawn, suddenly there are people losing their jobs. The inefficient farms, that they're, instead of spending or costing them $100 to produce, I'm using round numbers here, $100 to produce a ton of wheat, it was costing them sort of $200, but that extra cost was hidden or offset by the subsidies. So when the subsidies are withdrawn, they're producing wheat at $200 a ton, and they want to sell that at more than $200 to recover their cost. But that means that they have to, because they've lost now the subsidies, they then have to double the price of their food, and that then moves sort of down the line. Now, there's some tragedies in this, because they're holding out for the $200 a ton on the grain or the vegetables, whatever it might be, the rice and so on. But then because they can't sell it at that price, because people can't afford it, because they can't sell it, then it's rotting in warehouses, and then it's not getting distributed around to where it's needed. So this is why the government's declared a state of emergency. But it shows how subsidies, when they're wrongly applied, create, or in this case at least can create, terrible inefficiencies. Now, the same could be said for, say, tariffs and quotas on imports. Some parts of the world, Australia was one of them actually, but some parts of the world, quotas and tariffs are used to protect local industry. But local industry, instead of using that as an opportunity to become efficient, have a vibrant export market, and all these sorts of things, instead of that, it makes them lazy, and these protection from competition means they become slack and incompetent, and they're not competitive in the market at all. The quality of their product declines, the cost of manufacture goes through the roof, and so on and so forth. Why should they modernise their plant and equipment? They can just go to the government and get they can just go to the government and get the government to restrict even more imports, and so on. So these are the things that corporations and individuals do. Now, if you look at, say, in the case of, in the late 1800s, Germany and the United States too, Germany and the United States put up a lot of tariffs and quotas against British manufactured goods. The British had the lead. They kicked off the Industrial Revolution, so the British had the lead on manufactured goods. And there were two things happening at the time. There was the tariffs in America and Germany went up to prevent British goods from penetrating, or limit the penetration. But at the same time, there were a lot of new industries appearing, like electricity and chemicals, fertilizers, optical engineering for precision work like microscopes and cameras, things like that. And so Germany at mass production, and Germany and the United States were at the forefront of this. So they used the protection from British, the tariff and quota protection from British manufacturers. They used it to become more efficient and to become technologically much more advanced in various areas, not just the new industries, but bringing mass production to the older industries, that sort of thing, and did quite well out of it. But not many countries did. Most countries, most areas fall into the trap of becoming less efficient when they're protected. So rather than using that, so it has to be a real national effort to say, well, we'll protect the local industry, but you must become internationally competitive. You cannot use this to feather bed and pay yourself a big salary while you sit around all bloated and watching the money roll. You can't do that. We won't let you do it. And that's where a lot of countries fail. This is where instances like the Nigerian intervention into the market. The market food production occurred. You also see it in say places where Zimbabwe, where there are vast tracts of prime agricultural land, some of the best agricultural land in Africa, and yet there are no farms on it because the government programs have so de-incentivized productive farming, and they've taken the farms arbitrarily seized it from the white people that had very productive farms. So Zimbabwe was once one of the biggest grain producers in or produce generally, but certainly grain producers in Africa, and yet they produce a tiny proportion of what they once produced, and again vast, and this is directly because of government intervention. This was along racial lines to try and say, well, these white people are on these farms, damn white fascist Nazi Hitlers and everything. If we get rid of them, the black people will go into the farms, these productive farms, very productive farms. The black people will go in there and they'll own the farms and they'll make the wealth and produce all this grain and so on. But of course, this wasn't so. They got rid of the white people, but the black people didn't go into the farms. So hence, you've got millions of acres of prime agricultural land that's lying empty and no one's doing anything with. So market interventions or interventions in the natural workings of the market are always fraught. Now, they can be done, but they need to be managed very carefully at both ends. You can't come in at one end and subsidise without also having some sort of control over the outcomes. So if the Nigerian government is a case in point, they've got a massive food surplus and a food emergency because people can't afford the fucking food. It's insane. You'd say, if you went into a first-year economics class, everyone would stare at you. Well, that can't happen. Market economics don't work that way. But they interfered in the market and they disrupted it to such an extent that you can have a surplus and a lack of affordability, which is, of course, why the government of Nigeria have declared this state of emergency. But intervention can work, but very carefully. But if you intervene at one side of it, the subsidies in this case, and you don't also manage it as it works through the process of coming out the other end, if they'd used these subsidies to make the farms more productive and to prevent people from farming on marginal land, then it could have worked. But they fucked it up, as is the case with most interventions. Now, if we look at the extent that the globalists are intervening all across the Western world in market operations, artificially pushing cheap peasant labour into the West, artificially creating monopolies and oligopolies, the farmer, the big pharma and the COVID vaccines and so on, artificially pushing the green agenda, the list goes on, then we can see that the problems are building up and building up and building up. And somewhere along the line, there's going to have to be a release valve that goes off. And when it does, it won't be pretty. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.